Welcome to Portals of Perception and to What is Healing, where we are exploring today with Alexander Love the nature and potential of parts work. What are parts and how do they work? Alexander is a healer and a coach, perhaps a modern day magician alchemist, helping people get in touch with the inner cosmology of parts and voices to liberate their energies and bring them into greater harmony and wholeness. Alexander, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. So happy to be here with you.
So, you suggested that we focus on parts work today, and I am guided to, even before asking you what parts are and how do they work, to ask why. Why is the discovery of parts work important? Why is it important for you today?
Yeah, beautiful. Um, I guess where I would begin with that is, to me, the importance of parts work and why to explore it is that I think often we orient to who we are as a singular entity. It's a very common Western sort of assumption that I'm an individual thing, and when I'm speaking a sentence, uh, there's only one of me speaking that sentence. And yet we find ourselves disenchanted. We find ourselves um, with inner conflict. We find ourselves in conflict with other people. We get triggered and we don't know why. Well, all of these things can be deeply understood through a look at parts and parts work. And, the ultimate why is that I think exploring this territory really supports us in learning how to navigate the complex human interiors that we have, which not only supports us personally, but as soon as we can navigate our complex interior, we're now able to interact with other people's interiors and other people. Um, and so it creates a landscape where we can reduce suffering, learn how to love each other more deeply, and ultimately come from wholeness as the primary means from which we're making choices.
Hmm. It's almost as though I'm hearing a whole Maslow pyramid or love pyramid there, because there is the way of addressing conflicts and struggle and pain and suffering. Number one, there is number two, navigating more effectively a complex world. There is number three, becoming more aware, more effective in how we interact with other people. And there is then number four and five, which is learning to truly integrate the larger premise of being a human and perhaps being in service to to this life and to the lives around us in a whole other greater, more whole way. So great. So now we know why we're going to spend the next hour swimming and exploring this. So how would you, if somebody never heard about the idea of parts and that we are not a single voice, which by the way we'll at some point get to, it challenges the whole premise of authenticity because you can be authentic maybe to 17 different parts of you and each authenticity will be different. And then there is how can you be authentic to each of these and then what might be authentic to the whole. So that's like something we ought to come back to. But so how would you describe your up to date today when you explain and describe parts? How do you describe it and what are they and how do they work?
Yeah, okay. Well, I begin with by saying that parts, in order to understand parts, I would invite that we begin looking at ourselves as an ecology. And we can begin by looking at our inner ecology, but ultimately the inside and outside differentiation collapses, and there simply is an ecology that we're in relationship with, that we are part of, that is part of us. But let's stick for now to just the sense of an inner ecology. When we look at Chinese character for awakening, it shows on the left, it shows the heart, and on the right, there's the character that can mean I or me. And that character at the bottom, it shows a mouth. It's like, it looks like a square. And really the invitation here is that the mouth is an opening. It's a portal. It's a portal through which passage can occur. Now above this is the number 5. Now in the old days, the number 5, it looked like Roman numeral 10. So there's a bottom horizontal line, there's a top horizontal line, and then there's an X in between. And the number 5 is a symbol for ecology. In essence, the lower line is earth, the upper line is heaven, and then the X in between is everything between and including heaven and earth that is revolving around a center. Now, when I say center, we have to be specific here, because I don't mean the center like the way there's like the core of an apple is the center of an apple. It's more like how the threads of your clothes are the center of the clothes. So this center is everywhere. It's the fabric of something, the way that the grain of wood is the center of the wood. And so in this, what we have in this number 5 is this sense of multiple parts, all the things between heaven and earth, including heaven and earth, that are somehow quote unquote revolving around a center as fabric. This is what creates an ecology. Creates this sense of ecology, of interdependency. So in this, the character for awakening, it's saying that the heart is a passageway to discovering who we are, but there's an implication here that who we are is a multiplicity. So with that as the premise, we can say that parts are looking at certain aspects of this ecology, these different dimensions of the self that when we are balanced, those parts are tapped into wholeness, they're tapped into origin, they're tapped into an unbroken dimension of self. But very often what will happen is they will forget, just as we all have that experience that we forget who we are, what we are ultimately part of. And when that happens, these parts will then start to take on their own sort of limited perspective, as well as find themselves in a narrowly defined world. So I have an angry perspective. I live in an angry world. There's a reality that I see. There's a perspective that I have. And then there's also the ways in which I'm prone to wanting to interact with my world. So every part of the self, when it's disconnected from wholeness, will start to narrow in its perception of how it perceives what is real and how it wants to interact. So I'll pause there, because there's a lot more to say, but it's a starting point.
Yeah, let me rethread through this. There's three big things. Three big things I'm internalizing. The first thing I'm internalizing is you are describing parts through, if I hear this correctly, through the lens of making a bit of the distinction between Western medicine and Chinese medicine. So the Western perspective, if we open the human body, there is the kidneys and the heart and the lungs and the liver. These are separate parts. But the way you describe parts was different. You describe, I think, that's part of your portfolio of services. You describe a Chinese Oriental medicine perspective where the heart is not just the organ of the heart. It's a whole system that permeates the entire human being, as is the kidneys. The kidneys is more than a physical kidney. So just that's the first thing that landed with me that, okay, I can listen to what you're introducing and even make that distinction. Because, and the reason I want to pause there before coming to how the parts forget that they are part of a whole, which is where I would want to go to next, but just clarify even further this distinction, because the Chinese perspective, if I'm hearing right, is a description of parts that are interpenetrating, overlapping, entering into each other's space. These are not separate parts as we can put the kidney here and the liver over there. Is that what you are inviting us into?
That's right, because if we look at this through the view of Eastern wisdom, or you were referencing Chinese medicine, what this medicine arose out of agricultural societies where we are, human beings were directly becoming with their world. We're always becoming with our world, but modernity has, for various reasons, has often created a sense of separation. I am observing a world objectively, which automatically implies that I'm separate from it so that I can objectively ascertain what it is I'm looking at. But when we look at other modes of knowing, and some of these the modes of knowing that emerge in Chinese medicine and in Eastern wisdom in general, we have a more phenomenological approach that I I don't have a, a heating system and a cooling system to separate me from the elements. I'm a part of the world. It reminds me of a friend of mine who spent a good deal of time living in a very remote area where it's like the bugs come in your house. Like the way what's going on outside is going on inside. And so there is much more of a direct sense that we are becoming with, we are being co-born with our environment. And so when it comes to looking at what you're saying, oh, well, there's the kidney and there's the liver and there's these different separate things, it's very difficult to look at it that way when you are in direct relationship to thunder, when you're in direct relationship to earth, when you're in direct relationship to your environment, so that then when we apply that to our interior, that same sensibility gets applied, that all of these organs are part of one fabric.
Right.
And of course, we have, Western sciences have started to find this. There's,
Yeah.
that's a whole other territory we can go into to look at intercontinuity. But certainly, just to speak specifically to the organs, Chinese medicine understands them as organ officials. So these
Mhm.
are thought of as different aspects of ourselves that have official duties, official roles. And these are physiological as well as psychological, as well as spiritual. And so these officials, just like we are physiological, psychological, and spiritual beings, when they say the kidneys, they're not just talking about a physiological organ, they're talking about functions, they're talking about emotional, spiritual possibilities, amongst many other things.
A whole ecology and a whole gradient of functions. And even if you still stayed on the western side of the street, as you say, biology today will, well, science today will agree that we can't actually look at the liver in separation from the rest of the human system, because you take it out and all its functionality is so much based in all the learning feedback loops that it generates with its inside the larger ecology. Okay, so that's very important, because right there you're grounding us in already two moves. One is parts are actually not physical, like physical objects that are separate. Move one. Move two, they are integrated, shape-shifting, overlapping, interpenetrating spheres in which there are representations, official representations, and yet and the third move, they each carry a certain voice or a certain function for the whole. So for me, that's just so very important before we rush to the quote unquote pathology or the separation event issue and the shadow and how we heal that. So I want to just linger and abide with this a little more and ask you the following question. What ought we understand about that natural condition, that wholeness, when all parts or all spheres function well together? What are some core premises, core understandings we need to bring to that before we even look at to where I will go with you next, which is, so why are parts, why do they get separated? Why do they get triggered? Why do they conflict and quarrel with each other? Before we go there, what must we understand about parts as parts of a whole?
Yeah. Well, one is sort of implicit in the question, which is that no matter how much a part feels separate, it's already part of a whole. So when we're looking at wholeness, we can't put wholeness, quote unquote, true wholeness in a polarity with like, oh, well, that part's not part of the whole, it's separate. That's not actually wholeness. And so this means that the places in us that may feel deeply disconnected, that's still part of the whole. It's not actually separate. So I think that that's an important premise, that wholeness means wholeness. The other thing that I think is really important is something I was alluding to before, is that every part of the whole, it has an observer, a perspectival, meaning-making lens. Every part has a sense of what is reality, and that these two things are not separate. We have philosophical traditions that will argue about this. One tradition will say, well, it's all in the eyes of the beholder. And then another tradition will say, no, you have to just accurately look at what you're tripping over. And then that is the way that things are. And the invitation here is that actually those things arise together. As my knowing lens broadens or narrows, so does my sense of what is real.
Mm.
The third thing is that we have different ways of becoming with the world. We have different ways of interacting with the world. And every part is going to have their own preference. So every part has a perspective, it has a sense of what is real, and it has a way that it likes to interact. And every part, that's going to look differently. But that's all part of a larger whole.
That's beautiful. So let's concretize this and almost slow down the conversation. And so, what would be a way for you to sample or instantiate that every part has a perspective, um, and and demonstrate that the perspective of different parts will be different? What would be a way for you to instantiate that?
Yeah. So we can look at this in terms of how parts have different developmental expressions. They have, another way to say that is they have different ages. Parts have different ages. That is, and this is something we can get to, parts have different ages when they don't get what they need initially and then sort of get frozen in time, you could say.
Okay, so well, let's just stay with that for a moment. So what are the reasons that bring about, in part, that being frozen in time, where we lose the tetheredness of becoming with the world? What are the reasons? You said one reason is they don't get what they need.
Yeah, that's one reason they don't get what they need. And we can step it back even further, even prior to that, as we can say that parts will sort of separate from the whole because human beings are sort of the masters of self-reflective inquiry. So because other species tend to be one with their identity. They don't look at themselves. I mean, some can. I think maybe elephants can, and maybe dolphins and magpies, but still some primates, but still very simple versions of that. But that it's really human beings that have this, these generations of exploration of looking at ourselves. That implies that there's distance. There's something looking at something else. And so for me, that's the fundamental premise, that there's that sort of sense of possibility for feeling separation as the sort of starting point. Within that, then we can get into stuff like, well, I had a need and my need wasn't met. And so then a part can pull away from the whole. So for example, let's say I come home from school, I am 8 years old, I did this thing that I'm really proud of at school, and I want to share it with my parents, but my parents are tired or they're grumpy or whatever they are. And what I need is for them to really see me as a competent, capable human being that succeeded at something. And then one of my parents says, "Oh, I'm too busy right now. Come back later." But later never comes. And then the other parent looks at it and they're like, "Oh, well, yeah, I think you could have done better."
Mm.
And so then the child isn't feeling seen and met in such a way that the wholeness that's arising in them, that curiosity, that natural sense of I did it, all of those natural features of our soul, our deep dimensions of being, is somehow not met and resonated with in such a way that it's acknowledged. So then what can happen is then a part contracts and it says, "Oh, I don't ever want to actually feel this way again." Or we could look in terms of the, trauma or things that are more intense than what I'm describing. And something occurs and I don't ever want to feel that way again. So now the system is going to split. It's going to create a split. Then, and we can get into this if you want to, but then things start to get a little more complicated, because then we have a vulnerable aspect of ourselves that's hurting. The system decides, I don't want to feel that because I maybe don't have the tools to do it well. So then other parts will come in to compensate and keep that vulnerable feeling in the shadows, to keep that traumatized feeling in the shadows. So now we'll have parts that are starting to manage our lives, and then in order to keep other parts off the radar.
Right. So when I take in the map that you're now offering, I experience it as as pain avoiding and fear of pain avoiding strategy of the psyche, where certain parts experience pain, in this case the pain of not being met, not being recognized, and then it starts to manage itself around those circumstances to not experience pain of rejection or pain of avoidance or pain of not being included. And then you're saying it will give rise to even other parts that will manage that part so that essentially it is protected from pain or from even experiencing the fear of pain. Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah, so one way to look at this is to say that there's the part that experienced, or parts that experience the initial ouch, right? And those are the things where, those parts tend to hold the traumatic experience of that moment, the vulnerability of that moment. And then we can look at it like there's two kinds of parts that come in to guardian parts. We have yin guardians and we have yang guardians. Yang guardians tend to protect through control. It's kind of a control, a gripping gesture. These are I just need to keep on going. I just need to, don't let anybody see that I'm hurting. I just need to keep myself together. I need to manage everything exactly. It's that kind of vibe. Then we have the yin protectors. These are the ones that tend to protect through numbing us out, through falling apart. So it's the opposite gesture. These are the ones that have a scroll on social media or binge watch a TV show or eat the whole bag of chips or drink a lot or, all of those kinds of compensatory patterns. But it's more through the numbing, fuzzing, falling apart. Some people will get brain fog. They'll start to feel really drowsy and sleepy and dissociated. And so we have these sort of two basic ways that parts will control, will protect, either through control or the opposite, falling apart. And all of that is to keep that initial vulnerable hurt behind the curtains. That's where often the shadow lives. So that's one way to sort of orient.
How important is it when you do this work to name the parts, to recognize them for what they are, to name them in the exploration? How important is that?
Well, I'll say it this way. I think naming a part. So, okay, there's some different aspects to this. It's helpful to identify when parts are in a protector mode or when a part is not in a protector mode, but is the part or parts that have received the brunt of a difficult experience. So it's helpful to have differentiation there. When it comes to naming a part, some people will do it automatically and say, oh, like that's my really controlling part. Or, oh, that's my angry part. But there's a little bit of issue that can come up there. It's like if I, instead of calling someone by their name, I say, oh, hi, controller. It's not actually authentic to their deeper nature.
Mm.
So it can be really helpful, and this is part of the process of parts work, when working specifically with guardian parts, to get to the bottom of where wholeness exists in them. And this, another way to say this is, what is their positive intention?
Okay. So what would be an example of a positive intention?
Yeah. So let's say there's a part of us that's really mean in our head. They say all of these terrible things. We might call it the inner critic, right? So again, we have this name where we're saying, hey, you're the inner critic. What we're doing is we're naming a behavioral function,
Mm-hmm.
which is problematic because it locks the part in like that's the only thing it's capable of.
Right. It identifies it inside a limiting frame.
Exactly. And so let's say, so this part is talking in our head, it's saying all the meanest things. And at first, what people tend to do is they want to avoid it, or they yell at it back, or they get mad, or they try to get rid of it. But if we were to approach that part from wholeness, from love, from curiosity, interest, and we start asking this part, okay, well, why are you telling them this? Well, they might start saying, well, oh, I'm telling them all these horrible things because I want to protect them. Say, well, what do you want to protect them from? Oh, well, if I tell them these things, then they won't try. And if they don't try, then they won't fail. Oh, well, what's your concern that if they failed, what's your concern would happen? Oh, if they failed, nobody would love us and we would be all alone forever. So we have two things happening here. We have the direction of, well, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't criticize? Which is, oh, nobody would love us. But then we can ask the other question, well, if you were successful, what do you hope this person would feel? Oh, well, if I was successful in helping this person and protecting this person, they would feel love and connection. And it's very common. So that's the positive intention. It's very common that parts will be mixed up like this.
Mm.
They'll say, oh, well, I ultimately want you to feel love and connection, and I want you to I want to help you never feel disconnected and alone. And I'm going to do that through telling you that you're a terrible person.
Right.
So the inquiry-based dialogical approach, both in therapy and also when I'll ask you in a minute about doing this work with yourself, is inquiring, searching to come into contact with a concern, with the concern that a part is responding to or acting out, number one, and then underneath it, the deeper, what you call positive intent, perhaps its perceived function on behalf of the whole, in the way the part perceive its function for the whole in its partial perspective of the whole.
That's right. And this, if we come back to the question of naming, I'm not a big fan of naming parts as a matter of practice. But if I was going to name a part, it would be in relationship to its deeper nature. Oh,
Mm.
the part of you. So the inner critic in this example I'm giving, I'm not saying all inner critics is this example, but instead of calling it the inner critic, oh, it's the part that wants me to feel love and connection. At the very least, what we're doing here is we're identifying the part by its potential and its deeper care.
I feel it. I feel it different in my system when I think about looking at a part of myself and saying you are the angry part or you are the um, complaining part or whatever part to saying, well, you are the caring part. You're a part that wants us to be able to love and be loved.
It
Yeah,
feels different.
it feels
Yeah.
different. And
Yeah.
we see this show up in so many traditions. We see this in
Mhm.
eternal family systems in their own way. We see it in Kim Barta's work, who does a lot of parts work. We see it in his tradition. We see it in Buddhism with this notion of enlightened intention. We see what's the deeper enlightened intent. We see it in Chinese medicine with this recognition of the deeper virtues that are inside of us. And so just as we are made of skin, blood, and bones, within the Chinese medical frame, that sort of metaphor for the seed, the bones, the seed of the avocado, it's a sea of virtue. And so, often you look in all of these different places and, they might call it enlightened intention. They might call it the deeper positive intention, might call it like these deeper virtues. There's all of these different traditions that are pointing to the same thing, that wholeness is intrinsic within all of the parts, even if they're feeling closed off from it. And so part of what we can do is to support that wholeness to come out. And then this creates deeper trust in the system because the parts, they often don't feel successful when they're trying these strategies that are kind of warped or causing harm because they're always getting feedback. We don't like you. And yet they're committed to helping, but they don't know another way. And so there's a way to really, by doing this and finding the deeper enlightened intention underneath and helping the parts experience that, they start to experience a much deeper sense of trust, that there's a deeper wholeness in the system from which they are a part of. You can actually start to train protector parts through nervous system practices so that when you get triggered, instead of getting triggered with a negative contraction, you can get triggered and then that produces qualities of luminosity, which in this case is not bypassing. It's using virtue as a means of protection.
It's attuned alertness.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
So you started earlier by describing that parts have perspectives, and they also there is the way they experience the world and interacting with the world through that perspective, and then there is their preferred mode of interaction, and then potentially when they are allowed and welcome into the dancing party, they may be allowed to discover their becoming with the world. So now I'm asking two questions. What else would you describe about parts work, and what would be a way to instantiate the journey of a part from recognizing its perspectival tone or bias or nature, and how it grows from that to a larger theater of possibility.
So step one, when possible, is for the individual that's exploring this in themselves, is to begin with accessing wholeness. Now, this doesn't have to, there's a spectrum of wholeness. Wholeness doesn't have to mean that you're, you know, exploding with blinding luminosity. It can be something like more extreme or more dramatic like that, but it can simply be, I'm feeling curious towards this part. And so one of the things I borrow from internal family systems, you can ask the question, let's say there's a part of you that you want to work with. The first $1,000,000 question is, how do I feel towards this part? If the answer is annoyed, I want to get rid of it, I'm scared of it, I don't like it, that lets us know that there's another part that's standing in the way of wholeness, right? Because, and it's taking over my sense of I. So when I say, how do I feel towards this part? If it's wholeness, the answer will automatically be, I'm curious, I'm loving, I'm interested, I'm compassionate. If there's another part that's in the way, taking over my I space, it'll be like, oh, I don't like that part. Oh, that part's annoying. That part's been criticizing me my whole life. I hate it. So then what we do is we ask that part that's in the way if it would be willing to move to the side, not go away. It can still hold its view. It's just trying to help, but invite it to just move to the side a couple inches. It's like,
Give us some space.
yeah. IFS will use the word unblending. It's like, are you willing to unblend? And then you ask the question again. Well, now how do I feel towards this part? Okay, well, I did feel annoyed at it. Now I feel scared. Okay, well, will the scared part be willing to unblend? Oh, how do you feel towards that part now? Oh, now I feel a little curious. Ding, 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 ding. So it can be as simple as that. But the starting point in an ideal scenario, the starting point is that we begin with some degree of wholeness. Because when parts try to heal other parts, things can easily get stuck. In fact, if I'm working with someone and something is stuck, like things are not moving, it usually means that they're not coming from a place of wholeness.
So
Yeah.
how do you give them an entry, an access point quickly to wholeness without bypassing, without that being some kind of a bypassing of what they're struggling with?
The practice that I just mentioned is really, really common, is what I'll do. Just asking the part to unblend, and then going through it like if people remember slides, it's like if you have these little slides and you have all these teeny little slides in front of each other, there's an angry slide and a scared slide, an annoyed slide and a hateful slide. You're just clearing all the slides so they move next. Just they're still there. But then there's the curiosity. That's one. Another, if that doesn't work, is you use a transitional resource, which means you imagine something.
Yeah.
Tends to bring love, curiosity. You imagine your puppy, you imagine your best friend. And so you visualize that person. And until you start feeling those qualities of love or interest or whatever it is in relationship to that person, and then you let go of the person and then you have the quality.
This second strategy is a temporary, at least, transitional bypassing because you're trying to, could be because you're trying to invoke a feeling-based, somatic-based, resonance-based experience to produce an ecology that's more curious, more neutral, not polarized. Um, and okay, but the important healing principle you're articulating is you want to, as swiftly as you can, access the presence of the whole, of the wholeness, because ultimately it carries all the remedies and all the healing in the world you need, and all your work is to actually clear the way to allow it in.
Right.
And what you're saying is you want it in the first place because it helps you clear the way better than any other part can do.
And this is one of the things that we get with a wholeness-based model. You'll see this in at least the earlier forms or the more traditional forms of osteopathy. You'll see this in some ways that people will practice 5-element acupuncture. You'll see this in some ways that people will practice coaching. We don't start with fragmentation and then by the end of the session are hoping for wholeness. We flip that around when possible. It's not always possible, but we flip that around and say, we're going to start with wholeness. That's the beginning. And then from there, we look towards the places, and this gets to the other part of your question, we get towards the places where the part feels fragmented. We inquire with that part from wholeness. That's where we start to get to know its deeper perspective. Because if I really don't like grief, and I don't like the parts of me that are experiencing deep-seated grief, it's going to be really difficult for me to be present to them, create a safe environment where they're going to share the fullness of their perspective with me, the fullness of their reality, the fullness of the way they've turned off from the world and are no longer wanting to interact. They're not going to want to show that to us in their fullness.
Yeah.
I'm coming from a place of, I want to get rid of you.
Yeah, yeah. So, so wholeness begets wholeness. Separation sometime will give way in the end to wholeness, but often begets separation. And what essentially you're saying is, the quicker, the more assisted I can be by wholeness into the session, the the greater the luminosity, the greater the ecology of possibility that's arising there. So, what about this which you just described, this sense of, say, I've experienced pain of a particular kind, and I can't stand that pain. Not consciously, but beyond that, that pain is too painful. So I've trained myself to desensitize myself from that pain, and now you're going to try and introduce me to being curious about the creative potential, the 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 greater something else that's available for me actually if I'm prepared to feel, to see, to embrace that pain. But I'm afraid of that. I don't know that I can tolerate it. I've disassociated from that pain for decades. How do we approach that?
Yeah, so this brings us back to the looking at the different types of parts. And so the part that is dissociating us from the pain, the part of us that's afraid of the pain, those are protectors. And so the first thing that I do with clients is I help them build a loving, trusting relationship with the protectors. Now, for some people, this can take 5 minutes at the beginning of the first session, and then we move on. For other people, especially if there's been a lifetime of traumatic experiences, if someone's had a hard life, sometimes there can be many protectors that are all sort of at odds with each other. And so before even going anywhere near that, the actual pain itself, I sometimes use the example of, it's like if you're the host or the hostess of a party, you're not going to just invite one person in and then have a really deep conversation with them the whole party. You're going to welcome them in. You're going to make sure they feel warm. They have what they need. You'll hang with them a little bit, and then the next person comes in, and then you help them feel warm. And so sometimes, for some people, when there's a lot of protectors that are avoiding everything, and you'll know this because they'll say, I'm really sad. I want to work with this sadness that I have been avoiding. And I say, okay, let's go. And as soon as they go there, they start dissociating. Some other part comes in and says, this is stupid. And you can see there's like a whole party of antithesis.
So, so at that part, That part, when you say building relationship with those parts, it's about recognizing them, recognizing their positive intent,
That's right.
and appreciating them for the diligent work and for the care, the care they exercise in their role, in their function.
And yes to all of those things. And underneath that is an invitation that they recognize that there is a wholeness at the center of this ecology that is profoundly trustworthy. You'll often find, and this is another thing that I learned from IFS, which is it's a really brilliant technique. You ask a protector part, how old do you think I am? Right? There's a part that's, getting, resistant, and they hate whatever they're doing, they're protecting you. And you say, how old do you think I am? Usually they say the weirdest things. They'll be like, oh, you're 5. Oh, you're 7. You're 3. And then you tell them, hey, by the way, however, you tell them how old you are. They're shocked because what they think is happening, they don't see wholeness. It's gone for them. That's not in their reality. What they see is the part they're protecting. So imagine that your job is to help this 3-year-old who's trying to navigate adult relationships. Of course, you're going to be committed and intense, right? About everything. And someone says, hey, let's start feeling this. Say, they're 3. We can't handle that. So the deeper premise is we want to show those protector parts. They're part of a wholeness as a center of the ecology. As soon as that happens, a deeper bond starts to form. They start to realize that it actually might not be their sole job to be that critical voice in your head to protect you from these deep feelings. They realize that there's a place that's actually capable of feeling all that stuff that they were scared of feeling. It's not all on them because they're not walking around as a separate individual in a disconnected inner world. And so once that becomes reconnected, then there's room to say, okay, can we check in with this other part that you've been hiding? And that's where the shadows start to open.
What do you do if, in the middle of this exploration, the person you're working with suddenly, I don't know if it's the right way to describe it, flips out of any of the parts and question the whole premise and say, well, I don't even know if it's real. All these different voices which you're calling parts. What is this? Is this just something we're just making up here? Which is like that's the rational part drops in, and you're saying that's another part.
Yeah, and so what I do is I try to speak directly to the person's depth and help them see. Sometimes that's my job, is to be I'm listening in parts. So all of a sudden, what we're looking for is, when do parts take over the eye space? And you gave a great example of what that can be like. All of a sudden, I'm like, wait, this is dumb. This is all made up. It's like, well, wait a minute. That part just took you over. And so would that part be willing to unblend? Oh, now I'm curious again. And now I can talk to that part of me. Oh, this is the rational part of me. Well, what are you hoping will happen by taking me out of this? Well, I'm worried that if you keep doing this, you're going to feel all these feelings, and that's going to ruin our life. We're going to have an experience of depression, and we're never going to come out of it. Oh, so you're trying to protect me from feeling depressed or okay, great. So then that tells me we need to build bond with that part until the inner ecology starts to trust that there's something deeper here.
Is this the object? Is this the object of working with parts, building bond with each part such that they find their own natural pathway inside wholeness?
That would be a great way to say it. I mean, there's other ways to answer that question, but I think that would be a great summary.
Yeah.
There's some other things around we might call unburdening, or many traditions, like IFS will use the language of unburdening. Some other traditions in psychology, they might call them introjections. In Taoist traditions and Buddhist traditions, you could call it karmic obscurations. There's different ways we talk about how parts of us can, for example, if someone assaults us, we're not just experiencing the emotional pain and rupture of that incident, but sometimes we also take on burdens, emotional burdens. It could be burdens that belong to the other person. It can be burdens that are coming from society, like a social introject would be like, boys don't cry, women are
Mm.
sensitive. Those kinds of things, they sort of, they we take them on as a perspective, we take them on as a somatic kind of weight. And so, yes, to what you said, we want to help parts discover their way back to wholeness. But as a part of that process, um, things that are untrue or not serving us either get released or they get transmuted. This is like inner alchemy. They get transmuted as a part of the process.
How do you handle or help a person handle if the objection they bring sometime early in the conversation is, well, this is all too complicated and and
Yeah.
and too many parts. I don't know that I'm tracking this. I
Yeah.
don't know how can I tomorrow. I have a busy job. I have a family to look after, responsibilities. I don't know that I can attend to all that. How do you deal with that?
Okay. So what we're looking at here, one way to look at your question is in the context of development. As we grow up, we have the capacity to hold more and more complexity. And so when working with people with parts work, we have to understand or get a sense of specifically in the interior, right? Because I mean, someone can navigate a whole lot of complexity with systems or thinking, but this is a specific kind of interior complexity that some people have developed already and some people haven't. So we have to gauge the spectrum of simplicity to complexity. With some people, it's just working with one part. There's just one part, and I'm helping them connect with that part and connect with the sense of wholeness. There's a part of me that's anxious. Okay, well, let's find some curiosity.
Mm.
When you bring curiosity to the part of you that feels anxious, what happens? And we just start simple like that. An example of this too could be if somebody's not really used to parts, um, they can do a parts inventory. So that means they journal. Every day, just connect with another part of you and just let it speak a little bit,
Mm.
right? And so I guess to sort of back up a little bit, it may be important to say, how do we even recognize a part? One of the ways we recognize a part is through looking. We can see it, inner sight. Just like you can imagine Bugs Bunny, you can see a part.
How do you mean that?
You can use your inner, all of the senses that we have externally, we also have internally.
Mhm.
So I know you're here because I can see you, I can hear you, I can feel you. I can also do those same things on the interior. So I can look and say, okay, I'd love to check in with this part of me that's really angry. Okay, well, what does it look like? Okay, well, maybe it looks like a version of me. Maybe it looks like sometimes people will, it'll look like something else, like an animal or some wild thing. Some people, they won't see anything at all, and that's okay. That's why we have multiple sensory streams. So another way that we can know a part is through feeling.
Mhm.
So we can feel the emotional sense of it. We kind of have a felt sense of it. Another way to know a part is through hearing. Usually very smart people that have a really strong cognitive capacity, but the other capacities are a little bit less developed. Language is often because the language, the cognition linguistic connection is often easiest for some folks. They can't see the part, they can't feel the part, but they can talk. They can just like talk into the nowhere, and then all of a sudden a part will talk back. They can hear the
Mhm.
voice in their head.
Right.
Then there's also the feature of knowing. I'll just finish with this one. The feature of knowing. I don't really know if I see it or feel it or hear it, but I somehow I just know.
Right.
But the,
And
yeah.
at times you would actually find it somatically in different parts in your body or in your space. Yeah.
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 Sure.
Yeah, yeah. So what is so curious for me to bring a bit my own journey in this, because I only in recent years I became aware of this kind of parts work and IFS, and it's more in the last decade. But because in my upbringing uh, in the kibbutz in Israel in the 60s and the 70s, nobody went to therapy, and uh, it was not something that was a lens that was even in my landscape. Somebody once recommended I should go to counseling just before I went to enroll in the Air Force, and I went to that session and it was boring, so I never pursued it again. But I then became fascinated by a whole developmental journey, and when I started working with executive teams in the early 2000s and started to help people deal them with the complexities of their jobs, then I already had this awareness that we were multiple parts inside. So I was awakening to this awareness that we are many in one, but not in a dysfunctional context, in a therapy context, but more in an evolutionary developmental context. That was my lens for 3 or 4 decades before I even recognized that, well, there was parts work as a main therapy strategy. And the developmental evolutionary inquiry for me was, okay, so if I have these different energy centers and if I have different intelligences within me, and they sometimes will pull in a different direction, I have a project here, which is how do I facilitate greater harmony and wholeness so that I am a harmonious orchestral piece rather than a cacophonous orchestra where each part plays a different part. So in the early 2000s, I was working with different teams in Silicon Valley, and once an executive said to me, well, I'm struggling with this and I'm struggling with that. And I had this idea that there was a way to address that. And we called a session with his team. We spent 4 days. They were paying me to do my own discovery lab with them. And that developed a modality that I then for many years applied, which was take them through a process slightly different to what we're describing now in the interior, but help them map the various roles that they play in their life. Okay? So you are an executive, you are a mother, you are a sister, you are a daughter, you may be going to a church, you've perhaps care very much for the environment. So that we would map, say, primary 5 to 7 to 8 to 9 roles. These are identities they have. Now, I didn't use the language of parts. I described it more as roles. And then we would spend literally a retreat setting for 4 days. We would describe the quality natures of each of the roles and the core value. And then there would be a setting where with them together, I'd work with one at a time in front of others, and we would facilitate a conversation between the different roles. Because one of the issues that they grapple with is I am sucked completely by my executive role. I am not the mother I wish to be, so I'm forever feeling guilty in my mother role. And we would unearth and let these voices come to the surface. It perhaps wasn't as interiorly attuned in the first place. And I more stumbled into it from a developmental and strategy of addressing as a whole, the human being as a whole, but people loved it. And it was highly effective. And I'm talking about it a bit in the past terms because my work evolved later more into strategy. And because after the '08 subprime crisis, companies were less inclined to spend budgets on developing people and more inclined to invest money in helping their teams win in the business place. But what stayed with me from these explorations was the luminescence, the kind of glowing sense on the inside that arose in the first place when people recognized that they had different roles, different parts, and that they could come into conversation with each other. And also, what I recognized from the longitudinal aspect of it, for most people, it was very difficult to sustain the results. They would be sucked up into the pressure system that they at least imagined that they were operating in. So, first, do you have any comment on what I'm sharing with you from that journey? And then the two questions I'd like to ask are, what do you see that helps impart those capacities with people you're working with so they're not forever dependent on you? It's one way of asking the question. Another way of asking the question is what is the parts work you do now, having been on this journey for many years? So I ask you three questions there. Any comments first to what I shared as my journey into this?
Well, I love hearing what you were sharing, and what stands out to me is that, at least from what you're sharing, why I think it was so luminescent. I don't know if that was the word that you used, but identifying the roles, but then you also said identifying the values, right? That's another word for positive intent.
Qualities and values.
Qualities and values.
There is a distinction. Value, like what is important for you that you're driving in this role, and qualities, what are you like? Are you playful? Are you sober? Are you discover the texture of and nature, and the fabric of that role? Yeah.
That's right. And so to me, from a Chinese medical perspective, you're inviting them to identify the seed of the avocado. And when that is touched, what does this part care about? That's why, so anyway, I was enjoying hearing it because, again, it's a beautiful example of, in different language, identifying the different parts, but then also identifying the deeper aspects of those parts, not just their presenting expressions, which can often look distorted or dysfunctional or whatever it is, getting to that deeper aspect.
Right, because without actually being consciously declared in this way, that was my intuition, I suppose, to not approach this initially as a problem. This is the trap, and this is what is powerful for me when you say, I want to begin with wholeness, or else I am pathologizing the parts, and in a way I'm locking the parts to a limiting context rather than starting inside the ecology of wholeness.
And this is a trap that some parts work traditions can fall into, where, I'm thinking of sometimes when I've met folks that have had years of certain types of parts work.
They fall in love with the differentiating, the dialoguing of the parts, and it stays there.
That's right. There's always my angry 14-year-old. There's always my, scared 4-year-old. And it's like, yeah, but we're an evolving, unfolding process. And parts, if we lock them in place, this is the issue around naming. If we lock them in place, then I think it creates a different experience than if they're allowed to grow and unfold and change. This is why, if we're going to name them at all, we name them by their deeper essence. It's like saying, oh, like my daughter, who is now 15, when she was 4, there's a powerful woman in her. That's not going to change. It's different than saying she's going to be a powerful doctor or she's bad at math. It's like, oh, this is like these deeper intrinsic capacities. Oh, there's a passion. You're a human who has passion. Every human has passion at a very deep level. They may never experience it their whole life, but there's a well where there's compassion, there's love, there's, all of these things. If we allow the parts to be seen there, then they're free in the realm of what they're discovering, what they're believing. All of that is subject to evolution and change. I think that creates a different kind of interior.
Well, so in the strategy or the way we've been developing in the work I'm doing with portals into the soul, the approach to what is called parts work is what we call now the inner conclave. And the inner conclave work is is exactly where you started. Is an inner ecology and invites to that we visualize that I am an inner conclave.
Yeah.
And so what I found to be very helpful that I don't separate those, but I mentally I note that there are three levels or three dimensions of the work. There is the therapy work, which is addressing pain, suffering, separation, fragmentation. There is developmental work, which is encouraging those parts to unlock, to reveal the the latent potential that they carry, in which the part informs the wholeness and expands and the wholeness. And there is a third dimension, which I don't know that I've even yet fully have the language of, but it's to do it's this is where we can talk about communion, connective communion, and where the parts of the self can either surrender themselves for the universe at large to work through the self, through the theater of the self, at which point your inner conclave becomes a conduit for the creative act of the universe. And there is also in that the sense that I can choose to invite into my inner conclave any wise person that is alive or lived in history, and I have many of them in my inner conclave, and or any deity or any energetic form or any essence quality, because I can choose to invite after I do and recognize my parts. Now I want to invite a part that I may choose to call patience,
Yeah.
or a part that I may choose to call compassion, or a part that I may choose to call kindness, because there is, and the premise in that is there is the essence of kindness in the world. And oh, by the way, there is likely a part of me that is very kind, but maybe I haven't discovered it yet. So can I bring in kindness for kindness to speak through me? And then it becomes a modality where I can work on issues, I can work on problems, I can work on difficulties, or I can step into the inner conclave and say, well, what do we want to work on today in the developmental? So the ground floor is well-being and whole functional capacity, where we can attend to separation and fragmentation. And then there is whatever it is that we can develop and evolve from that in the second and the third floor. How is this resonating with your work?
Absolutely. So for me, there's a lot of yummy stuff here. So for me, when I'm working with parts, they often, given also that I work with clients who come in and say, "Hey, I'm having a hard time," and that's kind of the starting point. What will start to happen is those parts, as they release and heal the sort of pain that they're holding, they discover that they're already emanations of wholeness.
Mm.
And so then that becomes part of that deeper inner conclave that you're describing, at least an aspect of it, where now instead of the critical part, this part recognizes that it is an emanation of wholeness that seeks, at least in the example I was giving, seeks to support love and connection. So now it becomes more a quality of being rather than a part. But the other thing that I want to bring up,
Let's just stay with this thing you said
Yeah.
for a moment, Steve, because it's beautiful and important. They become a quality of being rather than a part.
that's right.
That's just so important. Yeah,
Yeah,
beautiful.
exactly. And so as sort of build on that, you were bringing up the possibility that different aspects of the self do not have to all resemble you and uh, your identity as a one person. And this is something that often parts work traditions are very focused on. I'm working on my inner child, which of course we have many inner children, but I'm focused on the part of me that is mad in my head or the part of me that is scared. But we actually internalize, going back to also to what you're talking about before around roles, we internalize everything
Mm,
that has had some impression on us. The the paint color on the wall when you were in a crib, the feeling of the fabric, the mommy, the daddy, the mean friend, all of these things, they get internalized as a part of this inner ecology. And one of the things that can be done that I find is really powerful is not only working with the parts of me that look like me, but let's say I had a really difficult relationship with my mother. I can begin to connect with the part of me that looks like my mother. It's not my mother. It's the part of me that looks like my mother. It's how I've internalized, but I've internalized her pain. I've internalized the things she said to me. I've also internalized her deeper goodness, her
mm,
deeper well of virtue. And so I can begin working with that mother part until all of the stuff. I grew up in the East Coast, the Michigas, the stuff that's kind of like as all of that liberates, then what's left is the deeper virtues of that mother part.
mm.
Now that becomes another emanation of the inner conclave, and I can bring that mother part in relationship to the parts that look like me that felt harmed by her. And I can start to still, the whole thing is being mediated by wholeness. I can bring those together. And when we do this, we start seeing that people have these beautiful reconciliation experiences because they start to understand their parent because they're right there. It's inside of them. It's not their actual parent. It's a part of them, and they start seeing it as a part of their inner ecology. And then as the virtues of that mother part or father part or mean friend part start to come out, then they can start um, basically saying, hey, here's all the ways you hurt me. And then they respond in a repair gesture. They say all the right things because it's an emanation of wisdom. They know exactly
Wow.
what to say. And then there starts to be a deeper level of internal harmony that then gets projected onto their relationship with their actual mother, their actual father, and so forth. So I just wanted to bring in that one piece because you brought in how this inner conclave, you can bring in other aspects of the collective. It starts to dispel this idea that our inner ecology is just us.
Yeah. Well, here is my intuition. I think we should do part two of this. Let me just map what I think we should address. So we probably will call this episode parts work, and um, perhaps part two should be called wholeness work, or wholeness mediated work. And I'd like us to explore more the practical work you're doing. That's area one with clients. Area two is what we just started to touch now, this different way of perceiving and realizing the way we get imprinted, the way we get uh, codified by our experience from the exterior, and how we create that blueprint and reproduce it in ourselves. And then take it another layer, which is recognize that we are talking about bringing and facilitating the parts into wholeness, and yet all around us there is a very fragmented world. So for us to then transcend the individual person dimension of this conversation to talk about our world and what, and there again I would like us to begin with wholeness as to follow your path and imagine what what a whole world would look like,
Yeah.
and work from there into, okay, so how do you work this in yourselves? And what that would lead us also into, Alexander, is what's the role and function of doing this work in a communal context? Like, do you do work with individual as part of a group? And what might be the power and the accelerant nature of being in the shared? I mean, part of the early days of tea groups and those other modalities, Samoan circus, they involved working in the middle with other people witnessing around you. And so what that does, I'm curious if, how would you, that we explore this, the idea of parts, looking at parts work inside the context of wholeness. All that I suggest we explore in part two of this conversation. How is that as a plan?
That sounds really good. And for me, there's always the question here for the sake, why? Why are we doing any of this? And a big part of the answer for me is so that as individuals and as community members, we learn how to more and more easily and more gracefully be able to act from a place of enlightened intention. So it's like there's a link from, there's all this inner work, but then what does this do for how I show up in the world? And ultimately, it's a way in which we can learn how to anchor and lead from wholeness. But of course, it helps us feel more free inside and we suffer less. But that has an impact on our capacity for enlightened action, because this place of wholeness is inexhaustible. And so it means that we have other potentials accessible to us for how we might be with each other, be with conflict. And so yes to everything you said. And I would also want to include, like, how do we link this into being out in the world and doing things, that it's not just an quote unquote on the cushion practice, but it's also a showing up practice.
Yeah, enlightened intention expressing itself in embodied action.
Yes, exactly.
Luminescence in action. Yeah. Alexander, this is beautiful and very enriching. Is there anything else you feel like you wanted to say today that you didn't have a chance to share? And there's so much in here, and we seeded what we will do next time. But is there anything else?
Well, I guess I would just start or finish with just an invitation that our human potentials seem to be so beautiful, and our ability to interact with chaos and uncertainty and darkness, our potential to be able to do that well is huge. It's vast. And so while we can look at parts work from the perspective of psychological healing, and it's important, I think, that territory, for me, the deeper invitation here is that we are deeply unbroken. We are deeply equipped to be able to face anything and lean into it and find the beauty in it and find the creativity in how dark times are invoking the evolution of things that are beyond what we can imagine, and that this is something we can do. Yeah.
Thank you. This is something we are doing.
This is something we are doing.
Thank you. To be continued.
To be continued.
Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.